Hey, Annie Purdue Olson here, and I am together with Michael Thompson, and I am excited again to talk to you about assessments. And Michael is here to talk with us about a church assessment that he has developed. So rather than an individual leadership assessment, which we've been talking about, this is a church tool. And Michael has been a pastor for over 20 years. In fact, Michael and I served together way back in the day, and we're pastors together. And in the last couple of years, you've moved towards consulting with churches, especially around organizational health. Churches and leaders need to be healthy and joyful, and there's so much potential there for churches, and you're tapping into that potential. And this assessment is a tool that you use to do that, and so we are excited to hear more about that and what you're doing with that. I also know that you are finishing up your PhD, and this is part of your dissertation process as well. You've got an MDiv, you've got a master's in, what is it?
Human relationships.
Human relations, and then this is part of the PhD work that you're doing. So this is a lot of years of experience and knowledge poured into this assessment that you've created.
Yeah, I really do have a heart for pastors, for leaders, for people who are serving others, and I really do have a desire to come alongside leaders and encourage them and equip them. So I found that I really love looking at things, organizationally from a 10,000-foot view and helping people to see inside the, whatever organization it might be, some of the things that come to mind for me as I interact with them. And I really like to help people find a pathway forward when they feel stuck, because I know what it feels like. I've been there, and haven't known what to do. And anyway.
Well, tell us a little bit about the assessment. What does it measure? How does it work? And just invite us into it a little bit. Yeah,
well, in my doctoral work, I came across an instrument by Bolman and Deal that's called four-frame structural assessment, and they assess a leader's natural bent toward leading, either from a structural mindset where everything is structural, like a Six Sigma kind of approach, where you go through this long list of structural things, and if it's in place, it's good. Or some people do human relations leadership, and their style is just to be everyone's buddy and keep everyone happy, and sometimes they drop the ball. And we all know people like this, but the people love that leader so much they fill in the details. And so that is an actual way of leading that can work for some people. And then there's some organizations that partner with others. There's the guy who's the leader who knows everybody's name, and so if you need someone to come in and do a seminar, he's got that in his in his file, and so he knows everybody and knows everyone in City Hall and all the other pastors and all these leaders, and so he leads through this grasping these limited resources and using them for the benefit of that organization. And then the fourth was really what I call faith building. So if you see some leaders, or you remember some leaders, like with the founders of who did the Mac thing, Apple. So they had these rah-rah talks. And so they get everyone in the organization that mattered together, and they would do this big cheerleading thing. Or if you think of the way that Amway works or whatever, it's like maybe everything else doesn't make sense, but they come together and make such a compelling speech about mission and so forth that it keeps people engaged and going even when times are tough. Mm-hmm. And so I took that mentality and I thought, well, how can I use these four frames to really develop an assessment that works for a church? And so I started with four, and as you got to see, Annie, I started with four, and then I actually ended up with 8 now. and so the 8, and the last time we talked it was 7, but I think 8 might have it. And so the 8 big picture categories that I use for an assessment are structural, human relationships, kingdom resources, And so that's making sure we utilize everyone's gift for the good of that organization or church. And then culture, that biblical culture, and faith building. So that's a fourth. And then fifth is Sunday morning. So these are specific areas now. The first were kind of general 1,000-foot view categories that really matter for every organization. For a church, you have to look at specific things like Sunday morning, because there's so much going on Sunday morning that will make or break a church. And then small groups and fellowship. How does fellowship and connecting happen? Leadership. Is leadership equipped? Are they just winging it? Do they have a good view of the vision, mission, values, and are they leading by values? And then lastly, mission impact. And that's the one that recently occurred to me, that has to be really measured in order to see how we're doing. Because if we learn all the right stuff but make no mission impact, we win no one to Christ. They don't see the hands and feet of Christ in action, the love of Christ applied in your circumstances. So anyway, those are the 8 areas that I really want to measure. And
I love those 8 areas, because it sounds like the first 4, your like big categories, are really assessing culture. They're really taking a look at how does this culture work, what is the culture, and assessing culture. And your like second 4 categories are like, how is culture expressed in what we do?
yes.
And I love that combination, because you can't just assess what's under the hood. You also have to look at how the car drives out, so to speak.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, that's one of the dissatisfactions I've had with other instruments, is that some are limited to just structure. And so they have all the check boxes. And even measuring how someone preaches are done by categories and structure. Did they go too long? Did they go too short? Did they use narrative? And so it's all structural. And so how can we measure the effect or impact of the preaching? How can we measure the overall health of people as it relates to preaching? How did preaching inspire this church and its people to become healthier as individuals and as functioning Christians? So yeah, I do have the 4 general categories, but then I really want to know how they apply. How do they work out on a Sunday morning in small groups, in the leadership teams and mission impact?
Yeah, I love that. That makes so much sense. Tell us a little bit about how you use the assessment in the work that you're doing with pastors and churches.
Yeah, well, so in the consulting role that I currently play for churches, they often will hire me to do some project for them first and build some trust. And so, for example, I'm coming to you from one of the churches that hired me to help them start a care team and get it organized and train their people in 4 or 5 different kinds of care for their congregation. And so, having earned their trust and experiencing a growing mutual really love and affection for the people here, they asked me to do an assessment for the church plant that they did a few years ago, and they haven't had a good tool to be able to use that. So in this scenario, I'm doing some work, and then they hire me to do the assessment for either a ministry area, and I could do them for nonprofits, but that's a different assessment I have, or for a church plant or for their church. I wouldn't be surprised if this church hired me at some point to assess the whole thing and do the full assessment for them. And so another church in the northwest part of Wisconsin called me, and they asked me to start a church-based training, but they also wanted me to assess their whole organization because they have 3 churches that were adopted. They brought their culture into the church, and some of them have 3 campuses, but they didn't start a culture. They didn't start an exciting vision-driven church. They adopted 3 different churches with different cultures into one organization, and now they have fights about music and stuff. And so, right, and so you didn't start with vision, so there's nothing to call their focus back to. So now they want me to do some assessment, and part of a big focus of the assessment will be starting with a vision, mission, and how mission-driven this church is. And right now, it's not. It's just scrambling. But they want me to help lay out a roadmap for that. And so it begins with assessing what strengths can we celebrate, and what are growth areas where we need a good map
Mhm.
set up before them.
Yeah, and then being able to leverage those strengths to actually conquer some of the challenges that they're facing.
Yeah, they do need to leverage strengths. And one of the things that often we forget to do as church leaders is to celebrate what went right.
Yeah.
It's easy to get so critical that we
Oh,
forget to really see the God sightings and really honor God and what he has done.
yeah.
And sometimes you can have so much against you, but if you get one thing really well and you care for your people really well, for example, you preach really well, sometimes celebrating that strength, will really go a long way to encourage you. And
Yeah. Well, I like how you call it God sightings, because it's like we don't always, I mean, part of the work of the assessment is actually noticing where God is at work. And you want to follow what God is doing. So let's look for where God is at and ask some questions about that too. I like that.
yeah, amen. Yeah, and a related thought is that when I first started putting together this assessment tool, and of course it is evolving the more I think through it and get input from people. But one of the thoughts is that maybe a church will be very strong structurally, and maybe they'll be fairly weak in knowing how to do culture and
Mm.
how to do inspiring talks, but they're really good structurally. And so that's something to celebrate, because if you have a checklist that just reminds you as an act of service and goodness, reminds you, oh, that's right, call your people this week and pray for them. Well, whether it's your way or whether a list reminded you of it, you've called people and you've loved them. And
Mhm.
so knowing your strengths and playing to your strengths, it's significant.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Mhm. What are some of the ways that people like are impacted by the assessment process itself, and then because as a result of the process?
Well, I think of two different scenarios. One scenario where I've been called to do an assessment, the leadership has had a great sense of relief,
Mm.
and the relief is we can actually figure out what's wrong and what's stalling us.
Yeah.
And so there's nothing more discouraging than wanting to fix or react or do something to take on a challenge that you face, but having no idea how to move forward or even how to measure what's right and what's wrong.
Mhm.
And so they have some sort of tool that helps you to celebrate what's right. That's very hope provoking. And then so the relief has come when I sat at a restaurant recently with a pastor, and I said, this is what I see. These are the 2 or 3 areas where I'm sure that on an assessment this will come up. We've had very little leadership development. People don't know how the process of visionary leadership works. And so in a recent meeting of all the pastors and leaders, I talked about the vision to mission to values process and how that turns into action, and how then we can measure everything by whether we're inside or outside of the core values, or we're out of bounds of them. And so it was very hope providing and provoking, because they could see an end in mind. They could
Yeah.
see a time where if they address this, things will actually get better,
Yeah.
rather than just hoping they'll get better and knowing in your heart that we're not heading anywhere near that.
Yeah. Sometimes I find that leaders and probably me too, we need a framework with which to like sort what is going on and put
Mm.
it into some sort of category to make sense out of the mess, especially when we're struggling, or when things are confusing. And an assessment tool like this really helps start putting things into categories that help you assess, okay, this is a strength and this is the area that we can target. And then when you know what you can target and you know where you're strong, that generates hope in and of itself.
Absolutely. Yeah, you're talking about mental models. And so God is the genius behind mental models. He set up the universe according to certain principles. He gave people different gifts. He gave people different temperaments. And he actually sets up his church with different kinds of influences And each church kind of looks a little different.
Yeah.
Well, that's brilliant, and that we can't figure it all out, and that God's in charge, and he's equipped each church a little bit different to meet a different need in the community in which it exists. And so these mental models help us to see how God designed us, both as leaders and as a church, and to play to our strengths instead of trying to be something we're not.
I love that. I love that. I work with a lot of individual leaders one-on-one with assessments to go, okay, like, how do you be you? How do you be the leader that God created you to be? But this is like looking at it at an organizational level and saying, what is it that God has called you to be as a church or as a nonprofit organization? What is it that God has called you to be? And how do you need to be the best version of that?
Yes, absolutely. In fact, one of the first things I do when I'm called in to consult, and I did this with a nonprofit organization, is I do that Bolman and Deal leadership assessment to see how God has wired each of the leaders. And so that shows a pattern of what God is calling those leaders to be. So if everyone inside the organization that is in leadership, if they all have a structural mindset for leadership and they're gifted that way, then they know first that might be just the way that God brought things about, and they can focus on that. The second part is that maybe they want a person or two on staff that's pretty good at relationships and strengthening staff and focusing on faith building. And so, there was one organization that allowed me to come in for a few months and do the CEO role so that I could do some things I couldn't do as a consultant. And so I looked at the gift mix of individuals, the temperament of individuals, and helped them to understand one another so they weren't trying to get the other person to be like them, but then also to have a staffing plan where we would intentionally factor in those other kinds of temperaments and leadership types or traits so that it would more complement the organization and fill in what was missing.
Yep. So the purpose of the assessment isn't simply just to identify areas of growth and strengths. It really is to translate it into action for that is specifically designed for that nonprofit organization or that church to be able to build and enhance their culture, to create that health that you were talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. In fact, the final step of an assessment is to sit with the leadership board, the highest governing board, and with the pastors and leaders, and not only share what I found, but help them to develop a specific either training or pathway forward so that they can strengthen our organization and most importantly, to become more healthy as a church and as individuals. And so by healthy, I mean a church and organization who most shows off the glory of God. And so what I mean by that is that an unhealthy organization will have the pastor do everything, and then the people hold up the signs and 8, oh, you got a 10 in your sermon. And so they'll be like consumer survey people in a restaurant who come in and do the secret surveys, and that's the role of the congregation. Well, that's unhealthy, and that doesn't magnify the glory of God. That creates a critical spirit. So the way to deal with that is to help pastors understand themselves both as leaders, but just as important as equippers. According to Ephesians, we're called to equip the saints for works of service. What's the result? That we more resemble the measure and stature of Christ. In other words, we show off Jesus because we see a little bit of him in the various gifts that are distributed within the body. So it's not just the pastor gets a pass-fail. It's that everyone is contributing in their own way, and it matters. Your gift matters, and it's online, and so we make room for you to use your gift. And then the success of a pastor or leader can be measured by equipping and not just being the doer while everyone else is doing the watching. So that's what I mean, where it ultimately is a struggle for glory.
Yeah.
Is glory going to go to leaders who will wear themselves out and burn themselves out? Or will we become healthier as organizations and as churches and let Jesus be glorified in the way that he can he can run his church way better than us through the distribution of gifts and the way that he's leading and moving.
It sounds like you get to come alongside leaders in organizations, churches, nonprofits, and really be able to use the assessment as a platform, as a way for them to frame out what God is doing now, and ask the question of, okay, now based on what your calling and your mission is, let's co-create the action steps. It's not like you come in with a one-size-fits-all plan and say, here's what it takes to build a healthy church. You're doing that on the basis of the kind of church that they are and the calling that God has placed on them for how he's going to reflect who he is through their community.
Absolutely. I was just in a room with 10 people, and they are the people who will run the care ministry when I leave. And so I provided some training. I'm going to provide some training for small group leaders who end up in caregiving situations. And we're going to lay out some pathways and some follow-up, once every 6 months, so that they can help sustain the growth and good changes that they've gotten. And so my goal is to equip those people so that by the time I walk out of the room, they don't look to me. They look to other gifted people in the room, whoever God's brought here and will stay here. They look to Christ, they look to the Word, and they look to the leaders here who are more fully equipped. And so my goal is to be visible at first to draw attention to issues, but then become increasingly invisible, deferring to people around the table who are gifted. And then I encourage them behind the scenes and equip them before meetings so they know what to say and how to respond when things come up.
Yeah. What is the most powerful impact that you've seen because of using this assessment tool with churches and leaders?
I think the most powerful effect, and I can't always guarantee how people will respond, but I think the most powerful impact is that I did this full assessment with one organization, and I think I was able to help them identify really clearly that they were trying to be everything. It was a nonprofit, not a church, but they were being like a church in that they were saying yes to everything. And so this so diffused the effectiveness of their and work and time of their employees and their workers, that they couldn't focus on the one thing that they excelled in. And so my word for them and my follow-up was focus. Yeah. Do one thing well. Just do one thing. So think of the relief of people scrambling and then management is racing around because they can hardly make all the meetings with all different kinds of sectors that are under the umbrella, and being able to say, I'm fired from everything but the one thing that God really gave to us. So that's one thing. And then the other is the reaction of a pastor who I'm about to meet with and start the assessment process. And he's just elated and calling me and saying, when is this going to start? And so he can't wait. And so to see that kind of humility, that's just supernatural. To be able to have others speak into your world. And most would be very defensive. But because of the trust that I've been able to build with this dear brother, he knows I'm not coming and looking for faults. I'm coming to encourage him.
Yeah.
Lift him up.
Yeah. And that's a point of a powerful assessment, is it creates awareness, but it creates the kind of awareness that leads us further and deeper into who God has already called us to be. And that's true for individuals, and it's true for organizations. And just as I hear you talking about like the impact of this assessment, as throughout all of our conversation, it has brought hope. It has brought relief. I'm not alone. I have somebody who's going to walk alongside me in this. And it's brought focus. Like, you get focused on the right stuff. I often talk about how we get so lost in doing good things that we lose sight of the God thing that he has for us. And it's true for individual leaders, and it's true for organizations. This assessment helps people get focused on the God thing that he's called them to do as a corporate community.
Yeah, amen. I couldn't have said it better myself.
That's
Focus is
my
such a
job
big
as a coach. I'm really good at summarizing what other people say.
nice, nicely done. Yeah,
Oh,
focus is probably one of the biggest issues that both leaders and organizations have. They try to be everything and meet every need, and we really don't have to. We just have to meet the ones that God has given us.
yeah, I love that. I love that you've taken the time to be with me and talk about this assessment. I'm super excited to hear more stories as time progresses. But I would imagine that there's somebody out there listening to this going, hey, I could use a conversation about that for my church or my nonprofit. How would they get a hold of you?
Well, all my information is on our website, and we're just getting things up and rolling, and in terms of our online presence. But the website is pretty well developed, and so you'll find my contact information: www.catalystchurchconsulting.com. And so my phone is on there, my email is on there, and so if you check out the website. You'll be able to find me. I'm also on Facebook, Mike Thompson, and of course, there's probably 1,000 of them. But
Well, if they've seen their video, they know what picture to look for now,
yeah,
right?
yeah, that's exactly. Yep, that's a giveaway.
Oh, well, I am super appreciative of you taking the time to meet with us. And thank you so much for unpacking the assessment and just talking about your heart and what the assessment can do for churches and nonprofits. I really appreciate what you do.
I've really enjoyed it. Thank you.
All right. Thank you.